Hey, Matt, can you unmute yourself?
And you have to say that whole spiel all over again for the public to be able to go ahead and understand.
That's nearly true. So we're. Can you hear now, Zach?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. Then we'll get to the meat of the matters. We'll talk about I'll run through our community engagement overview. I just want to make sure this committee is briefed on kind of what's going on to complement this process with the WAC and the TAC and the PAC. Then we have a veteran from the 2013 IWRP study with us from AE2S today. Mr. Nate Weidenberger is going to present, kind of give you a little more detail and color of what went into the current plan that's in place. Then we'll turn it over to our friend Nate, who's joining us virtually this time, who is going to talk about the basis of planning. And that's one of the main goals coming out of this meeting, is going to get some guidance for A2S and the city team on what this committee thinks about for the basis of planning, which we started talking about last time. Then we'll preview some water alternatives to consider, both those that were considered in the original process, and then we'll see if there's any immediate ones that come to the fore from this group for consideration. And then we'll preview the meeting on August 20th. So before we get too far down the road, I want to turn over to Jessica Alstrom to talk about the public process.
Great. So should we do an introduction real quick, maybe?
Yeah.
I know that the TAC knows everyone and met last time, but we have our commission liaison, Deputy Mayor Joey Morrison with us. Joey, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, excited to be here. This has been, I think, obviously on the public's minds a lot on how we're managing our water resources in the city. So the integrated water resource plan has been in conversation with the commission and the city manager for quite a while now. And so I'm really excited to be here in this engagement process and honored to be here. I think when we were given where this lines up with it being an election year, I think we wanted to have somebody who we are certain can be the liaison for the duration of the process. And so I'm really excited to be able to be the conduit between the commission and this group. I'm excited to be here.
Welcome.
Yeah, for Joey's benefit, do you want to mind going around the horn on the committee just real quickly, say hello, start you out.
Yeah, Alan English. I'm with the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology, hydrogeologist.
Holly Hill with the Gallatin Watershed.
To Marshnego. We know each other pretty well already. Phoenix Engineering was my past engineering company, who retired now.
Coming out of retirement.
Yeah, I gotta keep the mind busy.
Rebecca Kernick from DNR.
I'm Danica Holmes, the Upper Missouri Water Planner at DNRC.
Good afternoon. My name is Clayton Elliott. I'm the Conservation and Government Affairs Director for Montana Trout Unlimited. I'm based in Butte, but work statewide.
So before I get into all the details about what kind of some of the changes will be to ensure that, you know, we are giving the public their right to know and participate per state statute, I did want to open it up for general public comment. So this will be something that we do at the beginning of every meeting. And so this is the time for the public to comment on any non-agenda matter relating, falling within the scope of this committee. There will also be time, as Matt said earlier, in conjunction with each agenda item in which a committee recommendation is being made, but you may only speak once per topic. Please note the committee cannot take action on any item which does not appear on the agenda. All persons addressing the committee shall speak in a civil and courteous manner, and members outside of the audience shall be respectful of others. Please state your name and place of residence in an audible tone of voice for the record, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. So if anyone in the room would like to give general public comment, please go ahead and stand up and maybe come over to the side here. Go ahead and do that. All right. So with that, we'll close public comment. And I'll go through some of, the logistics to, again, ensure that we're meeting state statute requirements. Going forward, we will be, taking minutes and then approving those minutes, on the next, TAC meeting. So next, the meeting in August will be approving minutes for today's meeting. That'll just be part of every agenda going forward. As I mentioned, there will be public comment, for in-person, opportunities. And all of the meeting agendas and dates will be published on the city board's calendar. So that's the same calendar where the commission meetings are posted. So everything will be published there as well. All of the meetings will be recorded and posted online after the fact. And then I also wanted to mention that quorum applies. So basically what that means is that no more than 50% of the members of this committee can discuss items, under the tax purview at any time outside of these meetings. And this would include email correspondence. Since we have an even number on the committee, 3 people is okay. So if 3 of you grabbed coffee and wanted to talk about some item under the purview of the committee, you could do so. But we can't have a quorum, so 4 people or more doing that. Similarly, if a meeting, if a few people can't attend a meeting and we can't get a quorum, we will have to cancel that meeting and, we'll, give you as early notice as possible on that as well. And then aside from all of the requirements, I wanted to call out that instead of shuffling around town every month and making it a guessing game, we will have, the same location going forward for all of our meetings, and that will be at Fire Station 3. So I'll send out that location information, with the next packet, but just wanted to call that out here too.
Which one is Fire Station 3?
Yeah, Fire Station 3 is on the Caro Parkway. It's off of Oak near the regional park.
Oh,
They have a larger room that can accommodate the public too, so.
thank you.
Yes. And with these changes, that required some changes to our charter, which were included in your packet as well. And so specifically the last section, the public participation and transparency, section of the charter was revised to reflect everything I just covered on that last slide. And so I wanted to, see if anyone on the group wanted to discuss the charter at all, or if everyone's comfortable with those changes. None, no questions? Okay. We would like to go ahead then and adopt the revised, charter. I did want to, again, open it up to public comment if anyone in the room would like to comment on the charter before, the group makes a motion. Seeing no public comment, would anyone on the committee like to read the proposed, motion language?
I'll move to adopt the proposed charter revision.
I'll second.
Okay, Clayton? Oh, okay, second, okay,
I didn't, got it first.
okay,
We're down.
We're good. Yeah.
but yes?
Yes.
So okay.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
Yes.
yes, okay, sounds great. All right, thanks for going through that, I really appreciate it. I'll kick things back over to Matt.
One thing I wanted to mention before we get too much into the meat of this is that we heard feedback from this group after our last meeting that it felt like there was a lot of information presented and not a whole lot of time left for conversation. Nate and Dak and I put a pretty dense slide deck together, but you're gonna notice we're gonna go through it pretty fast. That's with the intent that we can have more conversation than presentation. So please stop us at any time to be able to talk through things in greater detail and amongst each other. We do have some time reserved at the end for a great discussion about items on the agenda that we'll be discussing. So a little bit of an apology for going to be flying through this pretty quickly, but I would hope none of you would be shy about saying, well, hold on a second, let's talk about that. We're going to be moving pretty fast, but there's always time to slow down and get into the granular details of this. So one thing we wanted to just brief on, make sure you're aware of is the broader context that this is happening in within the city. You'll recall that The goals of the engagement are to, one of them is to consult and involve the public. So we want to get feedback on a variety of items, goals, alternatives being considered, and then use that information so AE2S can plug it into their calculus and show where public comment was incorporated. So we'll be soliciting public comment from this group, the TAC, and together all you form the WAC, the WAC. And then we're also going to be hosting a series of open houses. Yeah, so Water Advisory Committee, the goal of this is to get a recommendation from the WAC, which is your group plus the Public Advisory Committee, we're hopeful that you'll go to the commission and say we full-throatedly recommend adoption of the updated IWRP, okay? So they will be looking for input from other community members through other channels. And then we're going to be reporting back to the community through those same channels. So it's going to be a two-way communication stream with the community. Right now, we're in the early engagement phase of this. I would say later on, at the end of this meeting, we're going to start to talk about going into alternative development and what the screening criteria should be. How should we evaluate these alternatives to see whether they fit and they make sense for Bozeman's water future, okay? And then there'll be a period of time when we go a little bit quiet with this group because AE2S is going to be doing their study work. When they come back, we'll reconvene and be able to have a good conversation about how they scored various alternatives and whether, and this would be able to talk through which of those alternatives make the most sense, which portfolio of those alternatives make sense. So these are some of the channels that we'll be working with the broader community. So digital, print, and in person. If you haven't been active on Engage Bozeman yet, there's pretty good information being posted up there. That's kind of our sole hub resource for this. We'll also be doing print materials, and we'll be hosting open houses. And of course, these TAC, PAC, and WAC meetings are all public and available for people to come and make comment and so forth. So we talked about how you are a subcommittee, so is the Public Advisory Committee. We anticipate starting meeting with the PAC later this summer or fall, and they're just going to be a couple steps behind you in getting, but we're going to be asking them a lot of similar questions that we asked this group. So, like I said, I wanted to mention Engage Bozeman is a great hub and resource, and I'd also like this committee to look at that with a critical eye because you're kind of on the inside, kind of on the outside, and so being able to bridge that gap for us and saying, Engage Bozeman is missing this critical thing. It would be, you guys should consider posting that up there. I'd love that feedback to be able to make sure that we're putting things up there that you think are relevant and important to the process. So that's a real fast version of the community engagement. It looks like we got a question.
Yeah, quick question. Just curious if it's possible to see a list of who's serving on the PAC or who you would hope to serve on the PAC.
Absolutely.
And I think with the goal of trying to represent, us understanding who else is being represented in the process.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's been finalized yet.
Okay.
But when that happens, of course, we'll be transparent about that. Yes, sir.
Along with that, it'd be great if everybody can provide just a little bit of a background bio so that when we have discussion, you can prompt, hey, I saw that you were involved with this and generate better conversation.
That's a great idea. Is that something, is that part of the homework? We could ask each of you to submit a paragraph of basically what you just said in your introduction via email to Jessica by the next meeting. Then we'll start building kind of a knowledge base, knowledge repository, and that'll be part of it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool, good idea.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, sorry.
If the PAC membership hasn't been finalized yet, I wonder if there's an opportunity to consider some of our downstream municipalities and neighbors being a part of that, where I sat in or heard some of the joint Belgrade and Bozeman commission meeting that happened a couple of weeks ago, and hearing potential opportunities for water availability planning potentially with other communities, and wanting to make sure that there might be some of that opportunity and yeah, participation perhaps from county. I don't know if that, maybe that's something to discuss later down the road, but maybe there's an opportunity on one of the committees for a representative.
Well, thank you all, for that. I'm available, online, offline, if you have any additional questions, about kind of what the bigger picture looks like, but, I'll, in the interest of being able to have a good conversation later, I'll, ask Nate to come up and, talk through. It is really great. Nate was able to drive in from Great Falls, today. One of the most important things I want you guys to recognize is he was a, lead project manager or lead for AWS on, the last IWRP. So he is a incredible repository of knowledge and what happened and when and why and those types of things. So we'd love to have a great discussion of any questions that you have, about how it was developed, why it was developed, and all the like. So I'll stop talking and hand you the bottom button is your magic button, sir.
Did it get figured out before I start talking? Am I doing the wrong thing?
Yeah.
Which
On
one,
arrow.
what you said?
I'm arrow. Sorry.
Down arrow, close.
Oh,
Back.
well, of course.
All right.
Well, hopefully you don't hold that against me. But it is great to be here to talk about the IWRP project. Interestingly enough, it's the first project that AE2S was a part of in working with the city on various things. And I guess calling me a veteran, I appreciate that. Alan, it's good to see you again. You were part of that effort as well. So it's good to reconnect with you, and for the rest of the people in the room. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this, because I think it was really a good effort, and it established some good roadmap for the city to proceed with its water supply planning efforts. In considering what we looked at, or why the city embarked on that initial IWRP project, is really a lot of the challenges here. If you think about where Bozeman is with respect to the watershed, being relatively high up in the watershed, and the issues related to securing water rights in closed basins, that was really kind of the genesis for considering that in the wake of some of the population growth that the city was experiencing at the time, even though it was probably in the wake of the recession. But even through the recession, the city still experienced some modest growth. And of course, with the population growth that's been experienced now, there's one of the recommendations, which I'll touch on later, is the fact that these plans, should be refreshed and updated over time. And so here we are. Another thing that was probably the most critical thing to talk about here is hydrology and the impact that drought, i.e. climate, can have on water supplies. And given the location of Bozeman, that was a pretty big concern as well. So when we talked about when we looked at the scoping effort for the integrated plan, really what we looked at was a portfolio approach, recognizing that it's probably not going to be one thing that solves the problem or addresses the issues that we had looked at. So what we did was we looked at water conservation and system efficiency, risk adjusted water supply management. You could ask, what the heck does that mean? That seems like a mouthful. Basically, that's, if climate or drought affects the amount of water that's available to the city, by its water rights, or you can have the right on paper, but do you actually have the wet water in the basin? That's what that is looking at. Integrated water utility supply development, meaning, what types of things could be done with existing supplies to optimize or potentially improve the efficiency of those. And then is there new water supply that could potentially be developed or available to the city? One of the things that we're talking about today is population projection as a basis of planning factor. We did that as part of the IWRP effort in 2013. You can see we kind of took a Papa Bear, Mama Bear, maybe a Goldilocks or Baby Bear approach to this, where we had different projection ranges of 1%, 2%, 3% with some paper on some of the higher growth lowering, just because as you start to continue to compound that growth, the numbers get pretty large. But actually, if you look at where, you know, the city sits today, it's probably closer to the high range of that 3% population. We're in 2025, so we bridged the gap between 2022 and 2027. We're somewhere sandwiched between that. I always say, no matter what you project out, you're gonna be wrong. But in terms of this, you know, given we were looking at some ranges, we actually hit the mark on at least one of them that they kind of made the cut. We didn't really consider the low range as something that would be indicative of what could potentially happen, and we were actually kind of right. Another thing that is important when you look at long-range planning is to think about how your water is being used in a community. And so we did characterize the water use, at least to the point, you know, in the snapshot of time that was indicative of what was happening in that timeline of 2013. And you can see, you know, at that point in time, how the municipality of Bozeman is using water amongst the residential, commercial, and, you know, we have a slice of the pie in there from Montana State University. That basically gave us some recognition of how, as you know, community growth happens, how, you know, using some type of gallon per capita bay figure can predict what water demand would look like in the future history.
These numbers that you're showing us now, are they updated? Are they current, or is this still reflecting what you had from the old?
This is very much old. And some of the information that you'll see in the basis of planning information that my colleague Zach Magdal will present later on will show how these values have changed over time.
Okay, so this is from the old.
This is old data, but it set the stage for, you know, what was being experienced at that point in time.
Great, thank you.
And those are in this report too, right? The 2013 report has all this stuff in it.
Yeah. Another component of, you know, doing some water resource planning is, you know, what does the city actually have? And how do you evaluate that? Granted, it was very cursory in nature, you know, just because of, you know, where we were at in the process and the scope of work that we had. But what we did was we looked at the various sources that the city has available to it in terms of the two, you know, Point Creeks, the Highlight Reservoir, and the Lyman Creek spring that feeds the reservoir as well. But if you look at those items, how did we evaluate those? We did apply some climate consideration when I mentioned that risk adjusted supply availability on that one of the first slides. You know, we looked at those. We said, you know, how reliable or how could those supplies be impacted? And so that we applied a climate model for that. And that's another topic of discussion here later on today in the basis of planning as well. So the biggest impact that we have, of course, is as you look at how you could potentially experience reduced amount of water availability, you know, coupled with some population growth, what happens is you start to identify some periods of time, you know, during the year or you know, depending on how severe you know, climate could impact or population growth or that sort of thing, is you start to identify some water needs. And so that was the other item that we did, was we quantified how much water would be necessary to meet the demands for both. We had a very strong personality on the board or on the committee in 2013 that was adamant about water conservation, and for good reason. If you think about the efforts that the city of Bozeman has completed since that time, water conservation has been very successful. And again, we'll be talking through that a little bit later, but you know, of all the things, we actually wrote a tech memo that discussed some water conservation opportunities that the city considered, and they were basically you know, described by these half dozen things. And I'm sure Jessica and her group has considered others over the past dozen years or so since that plan was completed. As we're talking about today, we're going to visit some criteria for evaluation. What we did when we brainstormed with the previous TAC was we said, you know, no idea is necessarily bad. And so, but what we did was when we got all those ideas, we went through like a 3-tier screening process where if you looked at the first tier, everything made the cut. But then what you said was, you know, could you really get that done in the face of water law in Montana? Could you you know, is it even close to being feasible? One idea that got, I guess, eliminated right away was drilling through the mountain over to Yellowstone River. You know, it's an idea that came up, and it not necessarily a bad one, you know, because it could technically probably be done. But everything that surrounded it, you know, just kind of people said, well, great idea, but let's maybe keep that one on the back burner. So that's kind of the way we did that whole brainstorming effort. And then as we moved up, instead of putting pencil to paper on costing and operations and maintenance considerations and all that, we call it qualitatively screened the alternatives that made the second cut. And then those that made the third cut is where we actually, you know, rolled up our sleeves and did some work in terms of, you know, costing out what those alternatives might look like. And then applying some information so that as we evaluated the alternatives, we had something to chew on with the TAC. You could say, what does this all mean? And what we were really identifying is a gap in terms of water supply. So how much water, you know, would the city need? And so we calculated that demand based on projections, reasonable conservation efforts, and what those supply yields would equal. So the net water supply requirement was what we were really searching to meet through those alternatives. Once, like I said, once we had those alternatives identified, we placed different alternatives in what we call the portfolio, recognizing that it was going to take more than one probably to meet the objective. And then we calculated or estimated capital and operations costs, and then calculated the net present value so that we could have that one aspect of the alternatives and the portfolios identified. So you can say, well, you know, what is a portfolio analysis? You know, basically, you know, on the screen here, it kind of describes that, but we did also want to look at, you know, when it looks at granularity of the water supply, we looked at the monthly time step, recognizing that the way that the water rights the city has, you know, you have, you know, some water rights are available at certain times of year and not others. So we wanted to look at a monthly time step to see if there were some alternatives that could potentially meet, you know, those monthly time steps better than others. The life cycle, like I mentioned, when those different alternatives would be required, when those capital costs would need to be expended, and then that recommendation of the best value portfolio. So when we
Can I just ask a really quick question before we keep moving forward? I just want to make sure that we're using that supply or supplies is being used interchangeably with like source. So like when we talk about supplies, we are talking about like the source of the water themselves, not necessarily like different downstream like recapture or anything like that.
Sure.
Okay.
Is there a word you prefer me?
No, I just wanted to make sure that was that was the case. Yeah.
When I use the words interchangeably, and it's supply or source.
Yep. Perfect.
That's a great point.
Thanks.
So the way that these alternatives were evaluated was, we worked with a national consultant. They're actually on our team with this effort as well. CH2M Hill at the time was acquired by Jacobs. So at some point in time, you'll probably hear some from some people that work for Jacobs. But we identified the evaluation criteria. There are a lot of things, a lot of ways in which you can evaluate different alternatives. And, you know, some people will place emphasis on certain criteria and not others, and vice versa. And so we set up those criteria where we had the TAC, you know, weight those criteria. And then when we developed those alternatives, we placed those into a matrix of, you know, how does this alternative fare with respect to all the different criteria? You multiply that score that each alternative gets by the weight. You sum those factors to come up with how that alternative or that portfolio best serves. And then you have cost, you know, which is a hard number. It's a quantitative metric. And so when we did this, we could come up with an overall scoring matrix where you had the benefit, which is, you know, how does the alternative or the portfolio fare in the weighting criteria, and the cost. And using that matrix or that graph, which I'll show you here in a moment, allows you to kind of see how the different alternatives and portfolios fare with respect to each other. And then, of course, when we had those portfolios graph like that, you know, then developing a recommendation and then figuring out the plan. And so I'll touch on that here again. But when we went through that screening process, we identified 22 total alternatives. We had some water imports, augmenting existing supplies if possible, developing groundwater within the basin, the Mystic Lake Dam or Mystic Reservoir, that was breached back in the 80s due to flood concern or concerns about its integrity, maybe restoring that, and then integrated utility and water reuse. I would say, that would be something like wastewater reuse, indirect or direct, stormwater capture, excess flow type things with respect to water law. What I will say is that, and Alan might remember this, is that there was a very heated moment back during one of the alternative discussions amongst the past TAC, where a lot of the alternatives with respect to integrated utility and water management didn't really get a lot of traction. And so if you read that document, you'll see, that there are a lot of alternatives that just didn't get the cut because what we wanted to do, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday, was that we want both the technical group and the public group to develop consensus. And we didn't want to have some of the alternatives be in the portfolio that was recommended and having a distinct voice or a very loud voice in the TAC say, I don't buy into that. I don't subscribe to that recommendation because it would just create fodder for when the city commission would consider the plan for adoption. I would encourage you to have a more open approach in this environment, in this second phase, the second opportunity here to evaluate alternatives, recognizing that some of these alternatives, if you do consider them and have them costed out and included in consideration of the quantitative approach, some of those weighting criteria and scores, may correct, for some of the concerns expressed by the TAC members. So when we consider the portfolio development, I don't want to get into this in a lot of detail. I'm probably already borrowing some time that Matt wanted me to skim over this stuff, but really these are the high level items that we identified, in varying degrees, especially when you consider conservation. But what we did was we picked with assistance from the TAC, we picked certain alternatives and lumped them into 13 different portfolios. And of course, when we came to the TAC with the 13 alternatives, Alan and his group said, what about this one? So we actually picked the 14th one, and that one was the plan, or represented the recommendation of the plan. So you can kind of see, how the matrix looks like in the table. And when I said, the ultimate objective here is to, graph these, really what you're looking at here is cost on the y-axis, and you're looking at that benefit score on the x-axis. So the further something is north on the chart, the more costly it is. The further it is on the east end of the chart, the more the benefit score. And so what that allows you to do is you can kind of say, well, these are the least costly, but they also have a relatively low benefit score. What you can do is kind of go up into the threshold of, where does it really make the most sense in terms of, what you're willing to spend and what the potential benefit is. And like I said, that P14 was a little bit of a modification, but it extended out a little bit on the benefit score with some of the lower cost alternatives, but didn't get into the upper range of, a high cost idea or plan for recommendation to the commission. So you can say, what was really included in that plan recommendation. We recommended that the city stand up a water conservation program. And I'm sure you've heard a little bit about that or know a little bit about it. We talked about, buttoning up the distribution system. So if the system was leaking a little bit, maybe going after some of that water, optimizing the system there. There wasn't a lot of gauging information up in the watershed. So improving that with some snowtail or, river gauging stations. Optimizing Highlight Reservoir as a really, one comment that city people will say is that stored water is really the gold standard of water supply. And then initiating facility planning effort for some of the capital improvement projects that might be necessary in terms of the long term. So one of the recommendations, of course, was to update the IWRP, and here we are, this is the second effort. And adapt long-term water supply strategies. So optimizing the Lyman Creek Spring, considering non-potable irrigation, potentially with some of the water rights that the city has acquired through annexation, impoundment options, basically replacing the Mystic Lake or the Mystic Reservoir, and then developing groundwater for the recommendations that comprise the plan. So I don't know if you want to entertain conversation now or.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, in typical form, Nate, you're too modest. You want to talk a little bit about the award that you won based on your work on the last plan?
Yeah.
And then I'm gonna give Alan a heads up, 'cause I'm gonna ask you to talk a little bit about your experience in the prior session, after Nate's gonna talk about this.
Ben, thanks for reminding me, and I want to clarify, I didn't win the award, but I had a hand in it for a little one, but yeah, the city of Bozeman was supportive of us in applying for a Project of the Year award with the association, it's ACEC, Association, or American Council of Engineering Companies, what that stands for, and they hold a conference every year here in the state. And we applied for a certain category using this 2013 IWRP as a project to be considered. And the first year we did it, we weren't recognized with this. We tried again, and we actually did receive that award. And so it was, really kind of I guess the ribbon or the bow on the project to be able to, say that we did that work with the city of Bozeman. I think Craig Woolard was there in the past to receive the award with us, representing the city. So, yeah, and I've actually given a couple of presentations about the IWRP. The DNRC, based its integrated water resource plan guidance using this work as the basis for that. So it was very rewarding to be a part of the project. Thanks.
Being recognized by your peers is always an honor. So, Alan, do you want to reflect a little bit on your experience during the last process?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall I found it quite, both educational and challenging. A lot of factors to consider, but I think that the group in the city did a good job of looking at all the different factors. The one thing I wonder about in retrospect is, we talk about water quantity and developing future sources or conservation. I think built into that is the assumption that all the water that we're dealing with is suitable for use. And we didn't really address water quality concerns, I don't think, as much as maybe we should.
What's it gonna take to get it to that potable level?
Excuse me, I'm having some allergies today, but so a good example would be if, looking at groundwater, for example, additional development of groundwater. If that's a possibility down the road, then one of the things that the city should be doing is making sure that the groundwater that the city has availability to is protected or at least monitored or clean or suitable, that kind of stuff. But I didn't really feel like there was any big gaps or anything missing in the process. I thought it was pretty thorough and,
You mentioned it was challenging. What was the number one challenge you were having?
trying to balance all the kind of competing interests. And I think, I approach it more as a hydrogeologist. I'm thinking like physical availability of water, but legal availability of water. Water, is a big part of that challenge because I guess my overall opinion in general for the Gallatin as a basin is that there is a lot of water in this basin. If you look at the overall basin budget, it's pretty impressive, but that said, timing is important, number one. But also the fact that, if the city, let's say, was gonna develop some additional groundwater, as easy as just finding a suitable place and drilling a well because of it's a closed basin and there's water rate issues. So I think, that's where I guess I saw the challenges is trying to balance that, but the two big ones I think are probably water availability, physical availability versus legal availability is a big one.
Yeah.
And then, like I said, I think maybe, and I guess it would hold for groundwater too, but, some recognition of the need to protect water quality is part of that. We did, and then in terms of follow-up, the one thing that we did do, the city had asked the Bureau of Mines to look at where they could potentially put in some high yield wells. And at the time, the challenger that, I guess the request was, where could we put in a well that's could maybe make 2,000 or 3,000 gallons a minute. And so with that, goal in mind, we did put out a report on that. And of course, what that does is it leads you to pretty much the really coarse material along the Gallatin River. So from Gateway, especially Four Corners to Belgrade, is really where the prime aquifer, so to speak, is. But again, developing that groundwater does not take into account water rights, doesn't take into account stream capture, all those things. So that's kind of where the challenges are. And then the other thing that I followed up on a little bit, which probably could use more work because I'm not sure where it was left, but was looking at Lyman Spring. So we did, I worked with, and I can't remember the gentleman's name at Public Works that I worked with, Randy. It was Randy something. He might have been with might have just been with water, but anyway, they did hire a consultant. They did some work on the spring box.
Yep.
And so between the spring box and trying to put a logger in there to measure the head in there, because there was a V-weir in there, and the meter, the water that goes to the plant or to town, you could get a pretty good measurement of the actual discharge from Lyman Spring. And for the roughly 1 to 2 year period where we had that, it's very clear that it's a very dynamic spring, which tells me that one of the things to consider in the future when we get into it is the climate impacts on Lyman Spring in particular, because pretty much all that recharge is coming out of the bridgers. And so if we see significant decreases back in the bridgers, Lyman Spring's probably going to be in that.
So there's feedback like that, which
Yeah.
I'd be happy that you're here.
So those are, yeah. But I mean, in terms of process and what I remember, it has been a while, so it's hard to remember all the details, but I found it pretty interesting and I thought everybody got along well. Back then, there was not, I don't believe, a TAC. It was just a TAC. So that's one of the changes. And there wasn't, I don't believe in that there was much public participation either, I think. So
It's a different time.
yeah.
How many people were in that group at that time? It was much larger because it was all consolidated, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't consolidated in the sense, I don't think we ever really thought of it as a TAC of a PAC.
Yeah.
So to speak. I do remember that there were quite a few people who would sit in on the meetings that may not have officially been on the TAC, but I think in terms of size, it's pretty similar to this. I can't remember exactly, but
I think it was closer to 10.
yeah.
Yeah, it was 10 plus, a commissioner.
So in this process, we're gonna have, we'll basically have almost 10 here on the TAC. We'll have a similar or a slightly larger number on the PAC. Trying to bring as many voices to the table as they're interested in joining and making it a very public process. So I wondered, we're here with folks who've been through this time or two, and it's specifically on this one in 2013. Does anybody on the committee have questions, comments, clarification about the process, about the current IWAP that we're working under, et cetera? We want to make sure Nate was here in person so we could really hold him down and make him answer all the tough questions. So
I had one follow-up, just kind of on what we talked about earlier in terms of the public participation and public comment. as to whether the TAC would be kind of informed of what the big issues are that the public's bringing up, just so we kind of know what the public perspective is. I don't know how that would work in terms of feedback, but because we're probably not gonna hear that directly unless somebody comes to this meeting, but
Yeah, would there be opportunity to respond or an expectation to respond, like within a given amount of time?
yeah.
I don't think so. To the response, I think it's probably staff that gets the opportunity to respond if there's a question along those lines. I will certainly keep my ear to the ground, and bring forward, it might be, packet addendums or something as a summary of here's what we've heard in the last month from Engage Bozeman, that sort of thing, if that would be of interest for this.
Yeah, I think I don't think it needs to be super complicated, just something simple, but just, I think it helps us if we kind of have some idea how other people are perceiving the whole issue and what their issues are.
And, or what major things are coming up for the PAC that how to balance the interests in what we're discussing.
And I'll note also, it's our vision for the TAC and the PAC to unite, after the first of the year, to bring all groups together. Say, here's what we heard from the PAC in its sessions, here's what we heard from the TAC in its sessions, and then to foster a conversation between these two groups. And I think that's where the real interesting conversations I think are gonna happen. So there'll be a time in the process where everything gets mixed in the bowl together. Becky, you were gonna ask something. I think it looked like you were about to say something before Alan made his final point.
I have a few things,
Yeah.
but I don't know if this is the right, well, I guess this might be a tangent, but are we going to discuss some of these questions that were put? How are we gonna use this?
So that's coming up later.
Today?
Mhm.
Okay, great.
So that's part of Zach's remote Zach.
Okay,
He's
great.
gonna run through his slides and then we'll time at the end of that to kind of go work through that.
Then all the other thoughts will wait for that. Okay, thank you.
Right.
First question related to that sort of attempted cross pollination between the WAC and the TAC, or the TAC and the.
You're not welcome.
It is the intention that when we come together after the first of the year, that's when those open house conversations would happen, because it seems to me that those open houses would be one of the prime venues in which some of this information that Alan was just talking about would be forthcoming. I mean, to me, that's the most likely venue in which members of the public are going to show up and say, we really care about X, Y, or Z. So do the public meetings happen after we come together, or is the PAC doing that separately from us?
So the planned public open houses are, I don't want to wait too long to start those meetings because I don't want the public to feel like they've been left behind and that there are things that we want to talk with them about. So I would prefer to get those on the calendar sooner rather than later. I want to balance that against having something to talk to them about. To say, here's generally what we're hearing from the TAC. So that, I think that's a needle that we'll be threading. But it's my goal to get one or two of those under our belt this calendar year, and then continue them into the spring for that.
That's great. I mean, I think at least in my sense of process, certainly I would like to have some of those public meetings when we have alternatives developed, but there is tremendous value in my view from sort of a scoping before we start building alternatives to hear what are the thoughts of the community and the public in terms of what alternatives should be considered, and then give us the opportunity to kind of wade through those from a couple different lenses, but that's my thoughts.
No, we're aligned with that.
Sure. The second question was, because I'm a legal availability nerd, I'm curious to how in the 2013 process, you talked about some of the alternatives and sort of vetting through legal considerations. How did the example you used was drilling through the pass over to the Yellowstone and bring it in, and that raised some legal questions. Was there involvement from the city attorney's office? Like, where did that legal perspective come in the 2013 process?
Well, that's a detailed question. We did have some representation from the NRC on the TAC, and so.
There was a couple consultants too.
Yeah, we did give us,
Hydro Solutions, I think.
Yeah.
And Deborah, and I can't remember like our last name from,
Stevenson?
yeah, what's her company name again?
EMS.
Yeah. So there was, yeah,
And
there were
Laura.
definitely people there that were,
Neighbors. Ready as well. It was Laura. So it was more the sort of internal TAC expertise in some of those legal questions.
there was definitely some perspective added. Great, I'm an engineer, I'm not a water rights attorney by any means. But we did, if there was a legal concern, if it was fatal, of course, it wouldn't have made it out of that, the lower level of the screening matrix that I showed you. But if there was, maybe a way to navigate the alternative through the water law process to get it approved, that recognizing nothing's really all that easy. But if there was a foreseeable path that could potentially be navigated, then we address that.
That's super helpful. I was just curious because looking at the committee membership, there was a little bit more like, I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on MPAN I play one on TV, Montana Public Access Network. But how some of that bubbling up of that water law expertise comes, because I'm not an engineer and my eyes glaze over when it's the engineering side of things. But wanting to provide that expertise. So that's super helpful. It's background. Thank you.
I'll just mention, we also have a water rights sub-consultant on this team, WGM, Julie Merritt, will be part of the alternative analysis as well.
I'm interested in recognizing the amount of work that went into the first IWRP and all of the, right, starting from scratch with all the alternatives and recognizing this is an update. And if we are, and assuming some of those alternatives are still probably relevant, to what extent we are kind of, updating, going back to some of those, understanding what was identified back then, or kind of starting new with this process.
I think, we have the benefit of having a lot of groundwork laid for us on this. There are likely, if there was an alternative with a fatal flaw, most likely it still has that fatal flaw. We could be wrong though. So I think I think the vision of this team is to have a review of all of those alternatives that this committee and the PAC wants a review of. I think there's also needs to be a recognition that there are elements of the IWRP that right now are working and are bearing fruit. And so I don't think there's going to be much of an appetite to support a movement, any moves to restrict or back up on any of those elements with that. So I think you have the benefit of experience and expertise and a history that we can draw upon, which might allow us to move a little bit more efficiently. But that said, we're definitely going to be asking this group and the PAC and the community at large, what alternatives are we missing from our list? What are the screening criteria? Here's how they were weighted in the past. Does this change in the intervening years since the last one was created? Talking about the basis of planning, which Zach's going to take up next, getting this group's feedback on kind of what's the rational consensus of where I think you were looking for Goldilocks on a few things earlier, trying to find that I think in the past however many years, decade more, science has advanced and we have more data and all these things. But that I think it's going to be really valuable to the team to have this group's input on, generally which way do you want to make those presumptions and assumptions? So I hope, does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Please, we've got a little bit. So a lot of things have changed since 2013 as well. I would like to think that when I mentioned that, there was some interesting discussion that happened, and, we got a little bit heated for a while. I do think that some of the people that were on the TAC that were involved, like the BNRC representative, I can't remember if we had somebody from DEQ or not, but one thing that came to light was there definitely is competing interests with respect to the DEQ and nutrient reduction in the receiving streams from wastewater treatment operations. And there is that competing interest against return flows. Getting that water back into the river, to support aquatic needs. That was really one of the cruxes of that heated argument. And I'd like to think that that prompted some discussion amongst the DNRC and the EQ in Helena to say, we have this, we're asking these communities to do one thing, and you're asking the communities, to do another, and those clash. And so, since that time, I think the state, the DEQ has said, that, land application of wastewater as a viable wastewater disposal strategy, that's acceptable. Even though it could potentially harm, the aquatic life that's in the receiving stream because that flow isn't there. But that was really one of the cruxes. So when I talk about, being open to that, in this round and opening the doors, some of the alternatives that didn't make that, the qualitative cut, that might be something that gets explored in the event that, if there are some mitigation strategies or other things that can be done to offset, some of those impacts, that might be a strategy that we look at moving forward. So that's just one example of what's changed.
I was gonna add to that, and Danica can probably do a better job, but I think since the last plan was developed too, is that there have been some changes in water law that would have an impact.
Yeah.
I believe at that point, I don't think the mitigation was necessarily a beneficial use, and I think, isn't there some change in the law now to allow that? Where people
Probably
could,
around that, yeah.
things like that. There's certainly more interest now in managed aquifer recharge and aquifer storage and recovery, those things, and
I will say storage itself on its own is still not considered a beneficial use.
right.
So mitigation for the purpose of offsetting an identified adverse effect.
Yeah.
That is the beneficial use there, but yeah, storage for the sake of storage.
Does that include like water banking, that concept of, because that was one of the things that people looked at in the Gallatin was taking water out of farmers and building a canal by Gateway, or not a canal, excuse me, a reservoir, where you could store that water and then either make it available for mitigation, or I think one of the ideas was even to allow for a significant amount of leakage, but then have wells downstream.
Oh,
But
yeah.
remember all that, but I
Yeah.
don't want to get us too sidetracked,
No.
but I think the point is that some of the alternatives that people looked at back then and either strayed away from or went to, you may look at a little bit differently now. I just don't know what all those changes are. Or
Curious about, you mentioned briefly that we'll also explore or try to pull out the aspects of the 2013 plan that were more successful than not, or that reached the desired objectives more successfully than some other recommendations or activities in that plan. And I'm curious if like, how do I say it? If that's gonna be more of a qualitative assessment on our part, or if there are like harder metrics to assess those successes built into the plan.
Answering this, but
Yeah, and I would say we want to develop the metrics to the extent that we can in the planning process, and advise as much as we can. Certainly there's limitations on, what we can spend as well with metrics, but
Sure.
we want to get as deep as we can into those, and of course, as you narrow, you funnel all the solutions down and you start to narrow that down, you can spend a lot more time on that smaller number of solutions and put, more investment into that. So
Cool.
I think each stage of kind of putting a smaller funnel on the menu of options is where we'll spend more and more investment.
Not reasonable.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think like with, an update to such a comprehensive plan, this presents an opportunity to maybe in this update, develop metrics, in tandem with the updates themselves, as we're able to, with the city's help, but I could see that hopefully helping the update that happens again, like the next update, so.
More data provided is accurate, is typically better, in my mind, yeah, with you. That's good, Tim.
This is actually going back to when we were discussing the public engagement. I think, providing accurate information, truthful information is better sooner than later. And the only reason I say that is I saw a very surprising post in the Nextdoor app. And actually it was regarding to the meeting, Holly, that you were at between the city of Bozeman and I don't know if that was with the city of Belgrade and who else might have been there. But the gist of the post was, oh, so it's a big lie that we have a water shortage in Bozeman because based on what was presented in this meeting, that is not true. And I didn't get into the details of reading it, but it was just kind of like, where did that come from?
I'm surprised to hear there's an inflammatory post on Nextdoor.
Oh, really? But it just bears the point of how many people will read that and kind of, respond to that in a way of like putting that doubt in. And when we're trying to just simply sort out how do we get this information, and it's not necessarily our job, but maybe the PAC so much, but I think I do agree that utilizing the Engage Bozeman site and trying to steer people as much as possible to utilize that for a place to find more factual information than just some of the other, social media sources that people will rarely go to. But I know that the city of Bozeman posts on Nextdoor on a regular basis. And so kind of countering that and saying, if you really want to know, go to our Engage Bozeman location for, recent updates.
Yeah,
So.
and you bring up a good point, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to prevent.
No, I totally get that.
Monitoring, it'll be incumbent on us to work closely with the city to monitor social channels in the community here, to try to answer questions that might not come in directly to Engage Bozeman, monitor those and try to, where there's a misunderstanding, to provide, documentation, as a resource to help provide more information. I think more information is better. So yeah, you do bring up a good point that that's an element that we can't ignore.
But I think at the same time too, for our knowledge, when they were referring to some meeting that the city was having with Belgrade and others, I think it'd be imperative for us to also understand what was discussed, what was the purpose of that meeting, so that if we are approached at some time, like in a public meeting, it's like, this was said. I'm a person who likes to always respond factually with what I know was said, not what somebody heard that was said. So anything that you can do for us to kind of help us stay involved with what the city is doing, what's being said at different levels would be helpful. I don't want to go searching for like, what was the purpose of that meeting? Why was that? And then what was actually said? So.
Yeah, I'm not sure I don't have knowledge on that particular one. But all of this is just talks, this speaks to that there are, water touches everything, in this valley, right? And it touches, it's deeply into the politics and the community and the neighborhoods and, all the competing interests, related to this. This is why we wanted to have such a large process. And I think that's, well, I know that's what the people of Bozeman expect, to have a thoughtful, open process that tries to consider all the variables and all the, everything that's in play here. So, any final questions or conversation about, kind of how, when, where, why, how the existing IWRP went into place?
Oh, I was kind of thinking about this earlier, that like in the instance that we are approached by someone and asked us a specific question or a question specific to our meetings and the work we're doing in here. I would love to be able to respond by inviting that person to present whatever comment they might have or question to this group. And so who can I direct them towards, like emails to give out and say, like, I'm guessing they can submit comments in writing.
Engage Bozeman would be the great thought for that.
Okay, so instead of emailing participants here or meeting organizers, go to.
Well, they're certainly welcome to email folks, on staff. That's certainly available.
Yeah, Dan, that would be me.
Okay.
So, I would look for the single repository of all those comments.
Okay.
I would love for all of them to show up on Engage Bozeman because there's full transparency there and
Got
there's accountability and whatnot.
Okay.
I'd also encourage them to come to the meetings to
Yeah.
learn more about it. There's opportunity, for public comment, at a lot of different times, so.
Certainly. Yeah, that's great.
Follow up, are the minutes from this meeting going to be posted on Engage Bozeman as part of that?
I think probably we can link them to there, right, Justin?
Yeah, they'll be posted primarily through the like city board
Yeah.
page where that's for, the case for all meetings. But we can link and kind of have those speak to each other a little bit so that everything's kind of transparent in both places.
Okay, and actually this is gonna go to our commissioner here. So with regards to, being short-staffed with the clerk's office, I was trying to find the minutes from the meeting of, that the city had on the working group from June 24th. And, because since you had your meeting yesterday, I wanted to kind of like see what was said because there was some things that were supposedly said. And, so again, I was trying to get the facts as to what was presented. And I actually contacted Alex Newby, the deputy clerk, and he said that they're struggling with already trying to put together the minutes of these different meetings to then put on Engage Bozeman. So I would suggest to you to work with the city to help them get more fully staffed so that we can do a better job of presenting this information if people want to hear it, because it's like, it's supposed to be out there, but it's not always there. So for what that's worth.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And there's a desire, I think, from what we hear from the public and from the commission of, hey, what are the ways in which we create minutes, for folks to access? Often cities are moving towards saying the video is the minutes until written minutes are added.
Okay.
So typically you can see the video the minute that the meeting's over, that you could go back and you can watch the video.
Sure.
But that's more cumbersome for sure, right?
Particularly when it was a 5-hour video.
Yeah.
And you're like, I don't have time. I was just.
You gotta sit down and watch it on double speed.
Yeah.
Yes, but I appreciate that nudge.
So.
Well, be mindful of the time and be respectful of your time. It would be okay if we moved on to the base of the planning conversation. We'll ask, Nate, Zach to come up, maybe here, and run us through your slides. And ultimately, I think we're gonna try to preserve the last 20 minutes or so of the meeting.
Yeah, we got we got a good amount to cover. What I'm gonna present is nothing different from what was previously presented. It just might be presented in a different way, showing the data in a different way. But we have about 40 minutes and to cover these three questions and then an introduction to the alternatives discussion. And obviously I am remote. The Wi-Fi here is not great, so I'm gonna turn off my camera to preserve bandwidth. But just wanted to show you all that I am a live human. So the three questions are: what range of population growth should be considered? How do we incorporate climate change? And how much should we rely on conservation? And again, these were presented previously in the June TAC meeting, but I'm going to present them again in just slightly different light. So next slide. So what you're looking at here is in the black line is true population from 1975 through 2025. And then the colored lines are various population growth rates, 2.5, 4%, 5%, kind of showing the range. And I'll remind everybody that this is a 50-year planning horizon. So we're looking at, just as the previous IWRP was, this is a 50-year outlook, so to 2075. Next slide. Just putting this graph to numbers, I think helps. There are a lot of numbers here, but the columns here are those same growth rates at 2%, 2.5%, 4 and 5. And what population Bozeman would hit at various years. Focusing on the bottom line is the density at build out, if you will. So I presented this before, but just even providing some more context, hopefully. So for example, at 5% growth annually in 2075, we would be at over 10,000 people per square mile, which is, very dense when you're looking at some of those example cities below. San Francisco, 18,700 people per square mile. I don't think anyone that lives in Bozeman is planning to be a San Francisco anytime soon, or anytime not soon either. Boise, another good kind of representative city, is 2,800 people per square mile. I'll remind you that the previous IWRP used two growth projections. Moderate growth, which assumed 2% for 30 years, and then 1% for 20 years. The high growth assumed 3% for 30 years, and then 2% for the next 20 years. The high growth rate projected a 2062, so 50-year out plan population of 140,000 people. And the moderate growth projected a population of 86,000 in 2062. So we're kind of looking at, I would recommend looking at a range again, similar to how we did in the previous IWRP. And Matt, if it's okay with you, I might stop between each kind of topic here and allow conversation.
Oh, great.
Okay. So yeah, I think we just open it up to conversation on growth rates, range of growth rates, and how this 50-year planning document should approach growth.
Appreciate the digging into their planning packets from last time's homework. So maybe, Becca, is there anything here you wanted to start off with?
I brought these questions to our Aggie board, which resulted in a lot of really great discussion. There were some specific to this question about growth rates. There weren't a lot of points, but there were one question that comes up is wondering, as we look at this, considering our presentation from the 2013 plan is the motivation for this update now, does it have to do with how much how have we diverted from what we thought we were gonna be, where we thought we were gonna be in 2025 when we made this 2013 plan? Is that question making sense?
I think so.
Do
I'm
we-
not a
So
great
that-
spot for maybe Sean.
Yeah,
Yeah, so basically the question is why do this now?
that's another part to that question, yeah.
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 So, part of it is really to open up the community discussion, because there's such a discussion around water in Bozeman right now.
Mhm.
And, you know, really that 2013 plan was written somewhat in a different time. I mean, Bozeman was a very different community at that point. We hadn't gone through the pandemic. We hadn't seen the massive growth rates that we saw through the pandemic. You know, so we really wanted to kind of reopen it from that standpoint, just to say, okay, you know, we saw this big growth spurt, and where are we at now? You know, kind of present to the community, here are the things that we've done, because we have a really good story to tell, frankly, and a lot of that story is work that came out of the last IWRP. You know, and I focus pretty heavily on the water conservation program, because, you know, again, we didn't have a water conservation program in 2013. So, you know, there's an element of telling the story as a result of the last round of IWRP work, but then there's also an element of acknowledging the changes that have happened since 2013 and saying, okay, are we still on the right path with what we have in IWRP? Because we are going forward with recommendations in that same plan. And if we're not on the right path, then what tweaks do we make to that plan, and redirect, you know, the resources that we have. So that hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it was, that does help with context. I think that the question, that question that came up with our board, was in the same, vein of just contemplating how things have changed from when that plan was originally constructed. I have a few other thoughts that are kind of surround the idea of growth that I'd love to contribute to this. It's not specific to growth rates, but.
Let me just say thank you for taking this out and bringing this information back. Like, that is a great example of how individual TAC members can be really valuable in this process.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll continue to do that. So of course, as you mentioned, thoughts that came up were, how we consider the effects that surprise global events have on our growth rate, and how do we try to make ourselves resilient to that and buffer those types of things. And there was concern brought up about city wells and what that means for allocated water. And there were questions about, as we continue to grow, this goes into more, you know, other city plans, but in what ways are we building? And that speaks to UDC stuff, and in what ways do those methods result in continued costs? There are all these anecdotes of basements going in inappropriate places, and people continuing to, like, 24 hours, 365 pumping their or some pumps into the streets, and all these types of additional costs around where site assessments would be appropriate in the valley or within the city, with consideration to irrigation and already allocated water rights and wetlands and site accountability. So those were concerns that were brought up that speak to the big picture around this plan.
And if you don't mind,
Yeah.
jump in and address a few of those. I love that question on the sump pumps with basements and crawl spaces. If you look back at what we did prior to, I say, about 5 to 8 years ago, roughly, we would put conditions on subdivision plats that literally write in the plat language that would say, we do not recommend a crawl space or a basement because you've got high groundwater conditions. And unfortunately, what we found is, frankly, a lot of the contractors would just ignore those, and they would still put in a sump. a crawl space or a basement anyway. So we've had to basically redirect that strategy in our development review process to say, okay, with the development applications that come in the door, the developers actually have to monitor the groundwater and identify seasonal high groundwater. And then if that seasonal high groundwater is pretty high, we literally write it right on the plat saying you cannot have a crawl space, you cannot have a basement in this area. So hopefully going forward, we're addressing that it's really hard to address that retroactively though, because if somebody's already built their home, to try to convince somebody to say concrete in their crawl space, they're not gonna want to do that. So the retroactive part of that is really challenging. And I would say, most of the development and, until we got into the far west side, until we got into the far south side of the community, didn't have that. It wasn't as much of an issue as it is in those parts of the community. So we kind of encountered that and we reacted to that. But, there was a period of time there where we would have liked to have done better. And then talking about switching gears and talking about kind of the groundwater development side of things, I think that's where this mitigation concept comes in, which is different from the 2013 discussion. So how do we, use mitigation water sources to mitigate that impact of any well? So, and that's a big area of focus that we have now. You've asked the question earlier about, how much data can you bring to the table to show us how we get to the best answer, and that is an area that we have quite a bit of data. So we've developed literally a basin-wide hydrogeology model to start answering that kind of question. So we'll be able to bring those details.
Quick question on, because of the homework questions, I think this was the one that I struggled with the most. In part being hypersensitive because I don't live in this community, so it felt like, some of these discussions of assigning what should or should not happen wasn't really space, although I view it as always open for business, so I can get my paycheck for viewing today. But that feels like a very personal question that the community of Bozeman is having to wrestle with, how and what growth should look like. For me, from a technical, like trying to get to a number of how to build a model or to evaluate alternatives, this felt like something well out of my sort of comfort zone. And are we going to have help from the community of Bozeman or from your firm to try to say, like, from a reasonable and academic perspective, this is a realistic projection of growth? These might be less realistic, or like, I just didn't feel like I really had the knowledge base to assign, should it be 1% or 2%?
That's fair. And maybe I'll ask Zach to chime in on kind of I'm not sure it's a what should happen, but more of a what is the best guess of what's likely to happen.
I only use should in the context of what should we build alternatives around, not whether or not the community should or should not.
Yeah. You want to talk a little bit about population projections as part of your process, Zach?
Yeah, since I'm an economist and a demographer and a scientist, and it's the crystal ball activity, and I don't have a great answer. I did want to address part of Rebecca's question, which was kind of where do we stand now as compared to what the 2013 IWRP projected, and we're pretty much right in line with the high growth scenario, which was again 3% for 30 years and then 2% for the next 20 years. We've been averaging right about a little over 3% since then. I will add to answer your question, Clayton, or maybe provide more context for you. A lot of and Sean can speak to this too, a lot of the city's near-term planning documents have been using 4% growth rate for those planning documents. I think, part of the point I'm showing with this table here is that 5% is not reasonable, right? I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't use that for a 50-year planning document, but it kind of showing that 10,000 people per square mile, is that really reasonable? I would argue no. So I don't know if I have a great answer for you, Clayton. And I think every time, at least as an engineer speaking from my perspective, every time we come to planning projects, this question takes the longest time. And in the end, I don't know how much it truly matters. What we need to do is pick a range, and show that and show what we assumed and kind of move forward is my recommendation.
I was trying to look this up, but I, figured I would just wait to ask while I was here and there were more experts, or there was more expertise in the room. I'm curious about or wanting to know what the current population is within the service area of the city of Bozeman and what it is in like the Bozeman metropolitan area in general, what those two numbers are, right now, as far as we know.
Current city population is between 58 and 60,000.
And city population, that's like within the municipality service area?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. That is as of what census?
Sorry.
I mean, that's not a census number, that's a rough estimate right now, based on non-census information, but that is all in the service area of the city's water distribution system. Now, that being said, the city has a growth boundary that is larger than the city's current service area.
Right.
And so that would change the discussion. We don't have service into that growth area boundary generally. There are a few pockets where we do, but those are pretty limited.
And I guess I'm thinking just, the city boundaries, shift over time. So, yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing, like, I'm not a demographer, but just thinking about how the supplies shift, so do our boundaries that we have around the people that are served, so. Could you repeat that range one more time?
58 to 60.
58 to 60? Okay.
Yeah, I just ran numbers, so if you look at the 2020 census, and I assume a 3% annual growth from that, that would put 2024 at 59,982, so just about 60 as of last year.
Cool.
If we assume 3%.
Okay.
Yeah, Alan.
Yeah, so I think we kind of touched on some of it, because that was going to be one of my questions to verify where we are now relative to 2013. And I definitely agree after looking at these numbers that 5% is out the window for sure.
We hope.
Yeah. So, but I get, and one of my questions was the fact that I think these density numbers are simply based on the current square mileage of the city limits. And I'm assuming that the city is going to annex in the future. So that's something that probably needs to be factored in, because we're annexing in a lot of existing development. I'm assuming a lot of that's going to be on individual wells potentially, or other public water supplies.
Alan, those densities are based on the growth area boundary, which is, I don't know, approximately 3 miles outside of the current boundary.
Okay, that's good to know. Good.
Well, at a little bit of perspective there, right now, city limits incorporates about 15,000 acres. The growth boundary incorporates about 45,000 acres.
Okay.
And what's the population in that growth boundary? Do we know right now?
I don't know what it is inside the growth boundary. I'd have to mine that data, but just within the city limits, it's in that 50 to 60,000.
Okay.
Okay, and then I guess the way I look at this question, recognizing kind of at the higher level, this plan, and there's a 50-year plan, that I think we definitely would go, if we just had to choose between the moderate and the high, I would probably recommend staying with the high, but I don't really know what the rationale is between doing like 3% for 30 and then dropping to 20 versus just doing 3% for the period of analysis, 50 years as an alternative. And then recognizing that in the grand scheme of all the things that we can look at potentially for new water development and existing needs, this estimate is one place where for planning, it's probably better to be pretty conservative, which would mean on the higher end, right? So we plan hopefully for a growth rate that's a little higher than what we want, with the idea being that if we can get anywhere close to those numbers in terms of water demand needs, should be in good shape. But so I guess, yeah, that would be my overall call would be 3%, 50 years.
We're not gonna be taking a vote on this, for any of these, but does anybody, concur with Alan's logic that that seems like a reasonable placeholder to start off with, or is there any, additional thinking about, where you put that magical number?
I would add that, you know, in thinking about that, I'm being realistic and knowing that it's not gonna be 50 years before the city probably looks at this again. So really focusing more on the next 20 to 30 years and hoping that we're not going to go past 3% growth, but yes.
Maybe just a question about that rationale. Are you thinking, Alan, that 3% is like within a range, or it's like just likely it will be 3%? Or are you saying like 3% would be a moderate range and maybe we account for a high range percentage?
Well, my understanding is that these growth rates would ultimately be used to go back and look at the need for water demand, not in the big picture. So yeah, so it is fairly simplistic and just assuming a general growth rate. But I think, I haven't looked in a long time at old growth rate histories for Bozeman, but you know, that would be something we could do. But I assume that history would tell us a lot. And while there have been spikes where we've been probably above 3, assuming in the long run or not. So I don't know.
But they're thinking, I see 2.5%, even though we've been on track since the last plan with 3%, and then it jumps to 4. Was there specific thinking in these developing these growth rate scenarios that
No.
excludes percent that we're currently on? Okay.
Nope. There was no reason to not include 3% other than confusing you.
Cool, thank you.
Are unhoused populations were they considered in the 2013 plan?
What population?
Unhoused? Or is that, I mean, I'm wondering if unhoused residents are considered, in population estimates now.
They should be.
Okay.
So in Montana, unhoused residents can still vote.
Yep.
The census still tracks them. They're incorporated in a point in time count by our service providers every year. So
Okay.
I don't see why they wouldn't.
Yep, I just wanted
do
to,
that in there.
oh, that's awesome. Okay,
Yeah,
just wanted
appreciate that question.
Thank you.
I think 3% seems to be fairly good enough to go ahead and move forward with regards to what our purpose is. And, Alan, you'll be here in 12 years to be reviewing this whole day one more time, Brian. So you could look at your numbers at that time and say whether or not that was.
I'll be there to point out that you were the one who started it. So.
We'll show a clip of this meeting.
Yeah. I do think that what we're already seeing from an economic standpoint, and this is not a town that is going to be attracting large families. It's too expensive. So we're going to see some economic limitations as to the numbers that are moving to Bozeman per se versus the Gallatin Valley. And I think that what type of construction is going to continue to be built for that is going to have empty houses. But I think that we can't get too complicated in that. I think that what history has seen, and from my perspective, it 2.5 in the older days. I think it is jumped to 3. I think 3 is a good number to go with just for our planning purposes.
Places like this are like going to be in our, like, already are in a lot of ways hotbeds for climate refugeism. And from like other Western states where, people are fleeing fires and they're fleeing their wells going dry.
Yeah.
And I mean, really, the desperation that comes from having either your house burned down or your well go dry and then having no other options but to try to go to a place where there, in your mind, there's more water. I think that does push people up here.
Yeah.
And I think it'll continue to do so more. It's, I think 3%, I would feel kind of uncomfortable with that in mind. That's something that kind of haunts me, going lower than that.
Well, yeah, because I mean, I think my point was that, using 3% better for planning purposes to overestimate a little bit rather than underestimate.
Yes.
So I'm not trying to nail what I think it's really gonna be. More just kind of focus on the question of what we should plan with.
Absolutely. It feels to me that might be a penciled in number. It's certainly gonna be a part, a contributor to the conversation for the rest of the time this group is together. So we can, if we have a change in logic or thoughts around that, we can certainly revisit that at an upcoming meeting. I'm looking at the clock, and I wanna, if there's no objection, I'm not cutting anybody off. I'd love to move on to the next item for basics of planning. And before I do that, I was wondering if you could take a little pressure off me and could I plan to keep you all for 15 minutes extra?
Yes, yes. I have one quick note. And this goes back to the conversation we just had with regards to construction in high water areas. And if we're throwing out wild opportunities, so if we were to go ahead and be able to go and utilize groundwater in those areas that are, I've been to a house that this was helping a friend out, and they had bought one of those homes where the crawl space was flooded. And looking at the neighborhood, there were other places that they had some pumps going out into the street and going into the stormwater. And I found out that other places they had contracted with plumbers to just simply pump it straight into the sewer system. So we're incurring a lot of additional city costs to go ahead and treat pure water at an unnecessary rate. So what if we were to be looking at optimal places to put a groundwater well that we could then use? We could solve a problem by reducing the groundwater level in those areas and reducing water that's getting pumped out of crawl spaces and into our city sewer. So on the grand scale of things of just looking at where wells might be utilized, I throw that out. So
Yeah, let's put that in the parking lot, and when we start talking about alternatives,
yeah,
please bring that up.
yeah, I did. Since it just came up, I wanted to just
Put it in the universe.
I'm one who want to go ahead, if there's a brainstorm idea, just throw it out.
Yeah.
Just as it comes available. And I guess wanted to check, are these growth numbers consistent with what the city from the planning department is also utilizing? I want to make sure that the city is using similar sort of projections.
Yeah, these don't seem, I can make sure that I have those for the next time this group meets and being able to compare if there's a discrepancy. And maybe Sean or Jessica can chime in too if there's a discrepancy between the numbers that came from the 2013 Integrated Water Resource Plan and the projections that we're seeing and how far above or below that we are and how that talks to future land use map and things like that. But I think that I think is an important part of this question of what are the projections for the Integrated Water Resource Plan, maybe being more conservative, setting a higher mark, though also recognizing those projections talk to our other plans, which potentially talk to our capital improvement plans, which potentially talk to the ways in which we're trying to invest in infrastructure and things like that. So, we want to be, I think it makes sense to take a more plan for more, and then we have more than we need. But also recognizing that there's, trying to keep that as precise as possible, because there are, when we're thinking about lift stations and facility improvements and things like that.
I just want to make sure that what we're talking about, and since the ultimate goal here is we're going to be presenting something to the commissioners, I want to make sure that these numbers don't, kind of rock your boat. It's like, why are those different from what you've been given from other consultants? So. Yeah.
Zach?
Sure. So moving on to kind of from demand or from growth to supply, and climate impacts. Just again for Nate covered this, but in the 2013 IWRP supply assumptions used a wet year and a dry year. And I would call those a typical wet year and a typical dry year. What you're seeing here in the last column is reliable supply, which I explained at our June meeting. I'll cover again right now. So the reliable supply is defined as the 1 in 50 year drought condition, and accounts for water rights that are more senior to the cities. So the city's legal supply is 16,500 acre feet. And then when you take that haircut based on, hydrology and legal rights during that drought condition, it's 11,900 acre feet. Comparing that to actual use, so in 2024, total city use was 7,100 acre feet, or 43% of the city's legal right, paper right, and 60% of that reliable supply number. I presented last time a little bit on how climate change may impact the city's water supply. If you could go to the next slide, please. Just summary of the 2017 Montana climate assessment findings specific to water. Warming is obviously expected to reduce snowpack, earlier snow melt, earlier peak runoff. There will be some months where water supply may be increased and some months where water supply is certainly decreased. And I think our question for discussion is what role does climate change play in this plan, and what assumptions should be made to account for that.
Folks' initial thoughts from their homework assignment.
Well, this is Clayton. One other thing that I would add, and this is more relevant, or not more relevant, this is coming from other discussions similar to this that I'm having. Most of the assumptions that we've been using have been all of these, the reduced snowpack, earlier runoff, the changing of timing of all of those water related events. The other one that we've been adding that I think is relevant, and this is particularly related to storage, has just been the increase of very high flashy rain events also that seem to be happening with an increased abundance, particularly, certainly nationally, you can look across the news right now, but even here in Montana and in Southwest Montana, I think we've seen more of those 1 to 2 inch producing storms that are happening, whereas, not very long ago, it was more days like yesterday, this like slow drizzle. So that would be the other assumption. It relates to water supply and some other planning conversations I'm having just around the storage concept of like, how can you take advantage of those flashy events to store water and save it through the meantime.
I think the IPCC just keeps, their reports continue to say, and they, as a group of scientists, continue to say that that climate is becoming more extreme. Warms are getting warmer, colds are getting colder. We're outpacing a lot of models already, so, in the same way, I think 3%, like, I struggle to go below that number for population growth. I think it's, I don't think it's outrageous to take maybe those more extreme scenarios into consideration, like, as far as climate scenarios go.
Anybody want to take the other side?
I was gonna add, I mean, I think my answer to that in general is that yes, we absolutely need to take climate into account. I don't have any doubt that we're gonna see big changes, and we already are probably. I have a harder time figuring out exactly how we address that in terms of numbers. But the one thing that I wasn't sure was factored into that question, especially since Bozeman's two main supplies are watershed-based surface water sites, how that climate impact could impact potential fires and hydrology on those basins beyond the climate change itself. But if we
Damaged watershed.
burned up,
water
we burned
quality.
up the highway drainage, that's gonna have a huge impact. And I'm not sure if that fits in climate change or if that's something that should be considered somewhere else, but that's a factor. And then, of course, I mean, I guess in terms of water use, the way I look at it is that if we, and I agree, I mean, everything I've ever seen, all the models, this is kind of the understanding that I have of what we're gonna see in general. But in terms of I guess I was trying to look at it in terms of, okay, how's that gonna impact the city's water use? It's gonna mostly be in the amount and the duration of water needed for irrigation. So the climate change impacts on indoor household use and a lot of the benefits we made in per capita, per day usage should help. But yeah, I mean, those are the two big things is, we're gonna need more because of climate change for irrigation. And then the question on fire.
And so, I mean, the point of these is to help inform the alternatives that we'll consider here that were already considered in the 2013 plan and that weren't, but that we want to. Moving forward.
You want to talk a little bit about that, Zach?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good way to put it. Previously, I showed kind of some of those projections of what climate change may do to that reliable supply number, reducing it in the mid-future by less than 500 acre feet, and in the far future, reducing it by about 1,000 acre feet. I think, again, we want to account for climate change. We want to consider it, and where and how we account for that is kind of what's up for discussion. I think in the end, if we use the reliable supply number is already a conservative estimate. And then if we use some, a climate projected estimate, that's even more conservative, appropriately so. But it doesn't move the needle one way or the other a huge amount. 1,000 acre feet in the far future isn't moving the needle a ton. And so I guess I'll just stop there.
I only say that because I saw there's a connection between you both were kind of pointing to potential alternatives that would kind of address each other's concerns, that these flashy events that we're seeing, how do we take advantage of those events and create an environment where capture is fostered and enabled. When there's fire too. I'm just picturing those as how the alternatives that we talk about are going to address those
There's
are
an argument for continued focus on resiliency.
Yeah,
So if
right.
you lose one leg of this multi-leg stool that we're working on,
Yes,
do the other legs, are they strong enough to still support?
right.
Which kind of supports one of the alternatives, which was to go ahead and look at potentially raising the highlight dam or changing the outflow.
We're looking at the line in Springbok.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
So Alan, I have one question for you. So educate me. How would a fire in that drainage change the amount of water still coming into the highlight reservoir? It would change the water quality going in because of more muddied water, but how would it affect, except for use of, from the vegetation of being able to absorb what precipitation fall? Could you speak to that just real quickly so I can follow that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not a surface water hydrologist, but I think, the big impacts would be that you would see rapid and extensive runoff. So it'd be a lot less water soaking into the watershed above the reservoir, and you would see that water instantly running into the reservoir along with a lot of sediment.
Yeah.
So that sediment would have the effect of reducing the volume of the reservoir a little bit.
Okay.
And that excess water would put us in a position where you gotta let the water go because there's nowhere to put it.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
those would be the two main impacts. Plus the
And-
water quality.
And similar issues that City of Butte and City of Hall have been dealing with in Ten Mile Creek and Basin Creek and trying to get ahead of preventative measures.
Fires can turn that soil into cement. I mean, in the short term at least, it really, really messes with the soil systems, but it also exposes the ground, and increases albedo, which is like good on one hand because it creates more solar reflectance, but, it really affects how water is able to penetrate and soak into the ground later on too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Loss of topsoil. Which,
Stability, yeah.
has the city ever done anything with regards to the depth of highlight as far as how much sediment has already accumulated and if that's ever even been thought of or as a concern?
Yes and no, and that, there were upgrades. I don't know exactly what year it was that the dam was upgraded. I'd have to go back and look at that. And part of that was the add storage. So, just don't remember the year and all the details because that was a long time. What I would say is, some of the areas that we have looked at, just addressing some of the discussion items. But I love the discussion because it's right on and it's all the stuff that we're struggling with is, we've done some field reduction projects. The city owns, some of the ground up the San Diego watershed, for example, and we've worked in coordination with the Forest Service on the ground that they own to thin out a little bit to reduce the potential for wildfire, or at least potential for it to spread. So we've done some of that work. And then getting to the kind of the question of, the flashy storm events. One of the things that we did recently with our engineering standards was we used to require developers to detain a 10-year storm event, basically on their site. And then most of that water then gets infiltrated in the ground. Now we require a 100-year storm event, based on historical data. So that storage does get larger so that we're capturing more of those flashy storm events. But those are just a few areas, I think. And one of the reasons I love this discussion because, I think it'll really impact on the alternatives that you select in the highway.
For the water nerds in the room, I'll reflect on my time at Denver Water, during which there was the Hayman fire, which was directly in our southern system's watershed, and it was low in our watershed. So the final reservoir in the system before it went to one of their treatment plants, it came about this close to having water quality that was so bad that they had to turn that plant off, which would have cut our supply by more than half. And also, after the fact, there was a major engineering and project where we had deep water saturation divers working off the platform to try to suck that muck out of the bottom of the reservoir, send it down the canyon in this very, very long pipe, and dump it out into some old evaporation ponds that were no longer in use, and that failed. It actually just failed. It was not removing the type of sediment that they thought, and they abandoned it. So even if you think you can, maybe there's some ideas there that are great ideas on paper, sometimes you get out there and you find out that it's not meeting expectations. So this is exactly the type of conversation we wanted this group to and the others talk about. Nate, it feels like you're being encouraged to be pretty conservative on the question of climate change impacts. Is there, am I right in hearing that from this group? Rebecca?
Yeah, I would add that, I don't have hard numbers, but 1,000 acre feet goes a long way when you're thinking about irrigating food for your livelihood and feeding the valley. So I would not balk at considering 1,000 acre feet being an important number to conserve.
That's a perspective.
To add to that, we are also thinking about the rain and increase in rain versus snow and flashy events and how that might affect when the dates of when water rights get turned off as well, and meaning that might be a lot sooner, and it would ultimately affect what the growing season is in the broader valley, and so then what the water availability is for more junior rights. For reference to this 5%, by the end of the century, the Gallatin River at Logan is over 75 degrees Fahrenheit right now. So,
as a trout fisherman, that breaks my heart.
Yeah.
And every drought plan that I know of, and a lot of the streams and systems that we plan in, their drought plans have been active for better part of a week.
Yeah.
Food out everywhere, yeah.
I would just, second or third or fourth or wherever we are in terms of being conservative on the overall yield. But also, Nate, as we continue to think through it, not just being conservative in what the sort of watershed yield number is and the reliable supply, but also helping us think through the sort of squishy stuff around the edges about changing timing of supply and flashy events as we get into alternative analysis. I don't know how that is going to be reflected in a model, because I know the task here is sort of to get to a reliable water right number, reliable supply number, but providing some context for us to then think about how we incorporate resiliency into the system as some of those other byproducts here are in place too. So.
Data assessment, can we go back to that last slide? Is that possible? So is the main question for the TAC here whether we should use the legal number, the reliable number, or are we looking at what numbers we would use to adjust for climate, which is a little different. So I just want to make sure I'm square, because if the first question is right, I would say you better use a reliable supply number.
Zach, what's most helpful to you?
Did you hear that?
Sorry. Yes, I did. I just wasn't muted, or was muted. I think I'd like to hear the city's perspective, Sean and Jessica's perspective on this, but I think what would be more useful is we're already using the reliable supply for most planning documents in the city, so it's more a question on the impacts to the reliable supply, and also just to answer Clayton's, or respond to Clayton's comment, which I appreciated, the timing of things and how climate impacts various months versus the overall annual supply may be a bigger constraint than the overall annual impacts. However, this plan is more looking at long-term 50-year annual supply demand. But I think we'll have to, as you said, Clayton, I think we'll have to address those timing constraints within each alternative considered. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, seasonality, yeah, for sure.
I have a question for the city about this reliable supply. So reservoir capacities, how often or when is the last time that bathymetry was assessed?
I'd have to ask our water resource engineer, he's not in the room unfortunately.
Okay.
What was your question?
Yeah. I'm wondering, when the most recent bathymetry surveys were conducted for the city's supply reservoirs.
How much volume is there?
Yeah, because, we were talking about sedimentation. Sediment input into those reservoirs can dramatically change that bathymetry and the capacity of those systems.
Right.
Has that been updated in the past? You know, I don't even know if anybody's.
We're asking right now.
done that.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering is like if that's happened since 2013.
That might be a question for DNRC actually.
Yeah.
It would be for state, we do bathymetry surveys as we're able with our state projects. That is something that we sometimes help with, in other reservoirs too, so. Yeah.
Yeah, just, the way the reservoir up there works, just for everybody's knowledge, it's actually a state-owned project, so the city doesn't own it. There's a Middle Creek Water Use Association that represents basically all the shareholders, for shares in the reservoir. And then that group chips in to, basically maintain the system.
Yeah, and it's kind of, those surveys are done at the will of the users and,
Yeah.
they're expensive, but, yeah, I'm not sure when those were done.
So is Highlight though, is it managed or operated through DNRC? The DNRC project, or how does that? I know that you do have some dams, but I wasn't sure if Highlight was one of them or not.
Is Highlight a state project? Yeah,
I think it is, yeah.
I was in Missoula for 6 years. I spent a lot of time in those reservoirs, but, I know that, our engineers in this region spend a lot of their time like traveling. The region here is huge, so I just always hear about them visiting some other projects in the area. And I can ask them too if they've had bathymetry information, but yeah. It depends, like Painted Rocks is jointly visited and managed by our regional engineer and the dam tender that rotates every year from the Water Users Association, so it varies.
I guess, two thoughts there. One related to the overall conversation is that maybe as we get down the road and we're looking at recommendations, one of them should be to get an updated assessment of Highlight. And the other, if it's not already in the works and maybe it's addressed in other projects, is because I do know that the city's been actively working with the Forest Service on fuel reduction in Bozeman Creek, Sourdough Creek. I don't know what's going on in Highlight Creek, but it was like for the 50-year plan, continued fuels reduction in those watersheds would be a logical component.
Which goes into the maintaining of the quality of the water that we do have.
Exactly. I know the new treatment plant, Sourdough, I think did make some efforts to put in, I believe they have a holding pond to address some impacts from fire.
Where when we designed the upgrade to the water treatment plant in Sourdough, we designed that specifically to remove a lot of sediment in the case of a fire scenario. Just the challenge with that is it's a really unique plant in that regard. And so it's untested nationally and internationally, but basically the design did its best to try to accommodate a high sediment condition. Now, that being said, another element that we are literally installing right now is to basically vary the intake in this a sand filter in Sourdough, so that if you get a lot of sediment that comes down the Sourdough drainage, then you get some filtration from that and hopefully not, get those heavy sediments that clog up the intake and fire. One other element that I would add to this basis of planning discussion as our drought management plan. So our drought management plan basically allows us to declare stage 1, 2, 3, or 4 drought, and each stage represents basically a 10% reduction in annual water supply. So it gives you a sense of if we were to pick the reliable supply number here as our basis of planning, basically the 1 in 50-year drought condition. Basically our current thinking is that you would use that drought tool to accommodate the climate change scenarios. So one of my questions for the group would be, is that the right way to think about this? Because if we can get a 40% reduction out of our drought, declarations, does that cover the climate change, or do we want to be more conservative?
I might just add on to that, not to complicate things further, but that will eventually, that question will relate to how far the group wants to take conservation, which is the next question that you were all left with. Because at a certain point, if we take conservation really far, we'd have to reevaluate our drought plan to see what those percent reductions, how achievable those would be. Because likely, right, we'd be kind of picking that, I guess if you can still call it low hanging fruit at that point, and we might have to reevaluate too.
I guess my response in general would be that I think the approach you're using now is probably a logical one, but when it comes to the actual numbers that you use, I don't know that I could really make any calls on that, but it seems logical to not necessarily, look at the question from just the standpoint of long-term climate, recognizing that if we have severe drought conditions, there's other tools available that can be used temporarily. Seems like it makes sense to me.
Think of it any other way?
So last year, Bozeman declared a drought condition, and you went into a system where you were dictating what days people could actually do their sprinkling, right?
We declared a drought in 2021 and dictated that, and then in 2022, we adopted permanent mandatory restrictions,
Okay,
which are in effect every year, and that might be what you're thinking of.
okay.
Yeah.
So do you have numbers? Were you tracking kind of like how much a reduction in overall water usage for irrigation was actually able to be achieved through that process?
So during the 21 drought declaration, we declared stage 2, and the goal there is to achieve a 20% system-wide reduction. And so from the declaration, which was, earlier in the summer, we tracked demand throughout kind of the rest of the growing season and did find that there was a 23% system-wide reduction. So, achieving the goal.
Yeah.
At that time, we didn't have permanent restrictions in place. So at that time, it was likely that a lot of folks were watering, 7 days a week in some
Yeah.
cases, and now that's not allowed. So, right, the needles moved a little bit on the norm, but at that time, that is exactly how it worked out, about 20%.
I guess it'd be good do you have any of those numbers kind of to present to us as far as? Okay,
The ones I just mentioned,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
drought. Yeah, I could
yeah,
present
that'd
that,
be great.
or at least provide them in some way.
So I'm hearing kind of continue the current logic that the city's been using on what is reliable during downturn, and that feels reasonable to this group. Let's turn the page to conservation.
Yeah, so again, presented this information before, but maybe in a different, slightly different format. So today, Bozeman's at about 120 gallons per person per day. The average Montana community is about 160 gallons per person per day, and then there's some comparable cities. So in general, Bozeman's doing really great on their conservation and lowering demand. Next slide. This information was presented previously in tabular. This is just showing kind of the trend since 2006 through present or through 2024. And it averaged about an annual reduction of 2% per year. Next slide. This table is from the city's water conservation and efficiency plan, which was published last year, maybe a couple years ago, and shows the savings and demand for various portfolios of recommendations. Coming out of this plan, the conservation program B was what was recommended. So the second to last row and the third to last row on this table are showing what that projected to save. So in 2040, if conservation program B was implemented, an additional 33 gallons per acre per person, sorry, gallons per person per day would be achieved to get to about 80 gallons per person per day in 2040. And I think that the discussion here is what additional conservation efforts should we be assuming moving forward in our demand projections?
Point, right? Can't conserve anymore.
No, we did talk at the first meeting that we've already taken a lot of the low hanging fruit, so I'm assuming that that rate of decrease is gonna slow a little bit. Is there, kind of looking at it, it's noticeable that it kind of starts to jump back up starting in 2022. Is that related to population change or COVID or something?
Could be
going on?
weather, could be
Random.
Yeah, this is highly dependent on climate and the how much seasonal precipitation was received. So I'd say that those year to year bounces are more due to the summer, what the summer weather was.
I refer you back to I mean, you guys are already doing quite well. Very others. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry.
Go ahead.
We went long, which brings me to a question. I'd love to start having these meetings for 3 hours, so we can feel, is that available for anybody's schedule? Or not available for anybody? Okay. Yes, we'll try it. I'm hearing maybe, there's a recognition that there could be diminishing returns when it comes to expectations for what water conservation can do. So to continue to look at that critically and not put too much weight on that. Yeah, Tim.
I just want to clarify, irrigation is not part of this table. Is because I'm looking at the plumbing code issues, and so is this just all in-home use, not including irrigation of lawns?
It's all domestic, so yeah, indoor and outdoor.
So this does include outdoor
It
also,
does,
okay.
yes.
And this goes back to what we were talking before, what the city is now doing, implementing with regards to new development and what they're prohibiting for outdoor irrigation of lawns.
Okay, and one thing that I would notice, a couple of years ago, we ran an analysis of how much irrigation the newer housing units were using, especially, with single family lots compared to the older single family lots. And what we found is a lot of the older single family lots didn't have pressurized irrigation systems in them. People were hand watering their lawns.
Yeah.
So that, believe it or not, the older lots from an irrigation standpoint were using less water than the lots coming online. So one of the things that we did to respond to that was implemented a new code, a requirement for any development that says, okay, you have to meet certain criteria for what landscaping you can put on a lot, as well as what irrigation systems you can use on those. So an example, I think I gave this last time, was there used to be, I think it was, what was it, 80 to 90%?
85% turf of your landscaped area in single household, and now we are limited to 35. So
it's responded to that one pretty dramatically.
Just for like context in the greater picture, we estimated that the implementation of that code, which went into effect last year, by 2040 will save about, I want to say 1,300 acre feet through that code. Just to give it context with all the other numbers we've been talking about, right? So, and then every measure in this plan has kind of these assumptions for what we would save by X date through implementation of them. You know, you're not seeing the details here, but
So these projections here are taking into account what you just said with regards to what was imposed in 2022.
correct. So these are looking at that and more. It's basically looking at everything that's currently underway in the conservation program, including, you know, those types of policies, as well as the ones that are outlined for implementation through 2040. Assuming, right, that those do end up getting implemented and or adopted as their policy.
And this is also impacting whatever regulations you have on commercial properties. Okay.
So these projections go to 2040 with we're estimating beyond that time frame, right? And so how does that play into our decision here?
I think, Zach.
Yeah, great point. I think what we should decide on, or what we should discuss, is beyond 2040. So the 50-year planning horizon is what we should be discussing, and I don't think these projections were estimated beyond 2040. I think that Jessica can speak to it, but I'm thinking the cap was at 80 or 79 gallons per person per day. Or was there not thought to that, Jessica?
No, we didn't look at it that way. It was just approached by looking at each measure that was implemented, and annual savings associated with that tied to about a 3% growth rate. For the policies, there's an assumption of not getting 100% compliance to be conservative. So we basically looked at every measure in the plan, in that way, and then projected out through 2040. We do have a model that I'm thinking we could reevaluate to see if there might be a relatively easy way to kind of project out farther, right? It won't be quite the same level of analyses that we considered to get to 2040, but it could give us a good gut check on what things could look like, you know, adding another 22 years on here. With looking at that model, we need some time to do that, but I think that would be possible if the group felt like that would be an important piece of information to have to make a decision on this.
And is our decision trying to choose between the different program, like program A, B, or C? Is that the decision that we're trying to come to together?
Great question. No, those, so those were the basically the three kind of portfolios presented to our commission in the plan. And then the recommended one was program B, which the commission supported at the time of adoption. So this is meant to just sort of demonstrate how far we think we can go now through 2040, as sort of just a basis of, I guess, a jumping off point for the greater discussion for the IWRP. I will suggest that, you know, program B, it's picking a lot more than just the low hanging fruit, right? We're doing a lot in that program. Not to say we couldn't do more and be more aggressive, but I think the question for the group is more kind of with this, I guess, very kind of fundamental understanding, like how far do we think we can take conservation? And if the group would like more information on any of this to make that decision, I'm happy to provide that as well, if this is too high level.
And I would add to that and say, I think we'll get into more of the details in the alternatives analysis. So far, we've implemented 11 of the 18 measures in that Plan B scenario. And some of those, you know, I'd like to review those measures with this group just to get a sense for what's reasonable, what's not, because there are some pretty extreme measures in there. And then basically take a recommendation from this group back to the commission and say, yeah, we think we can get there using these techniques or not.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to to get a little bit more information for the group to make sure. I mean,
Perfect.
when I read the question, it's kind of like, well, yeah, I mean, we got to continue to rely on conservation and there's definitely room for additional conservation there. I'm just concerned that if the question is, it's kind of like how much do we rely on it? I have a hard time putting a number on that. Well, my overall impression is that it's going to get harder and harder to save water through conservation, that, in the next 50 years, we're going to have to be looking more towards additional water supply.
Well, I think one of the advantages we have is that because of the growth that we do have and the improvements that have been made through the various building codes, there is an innate conservation aspect built into those building codes. So because of how much more growth is going to be coming, what they have to build is already implemented. So we're not trying to go ahead and do anything there. So if you're comparing what old Bozeman town would have been using through the older construction techniques, that's going to be different than what we're seeing coming down the line. So that only goes to our favor. So just so I understand, you will be going ahead and presenting to us, would you say 18 points of conservation program B? Okay, great.
I was gonna recommend, we're dangerously close to losing quorum, so I was gonna suggest we kind of table this until we can bring a little bit more information, and Dave was gonna jump in with a comment.
Just one thing to kind of remember about conservation is as those numbers continue to ratchet down, as lower the average use, we call that demand hardening, meaning that it's more difficult to reduce at a significant rate, if you're going to need to do some adaptation for climate impacts or the drought plan. So just recognize that, whatever target you set, you are impacting the flexibility, for other measures that the city has to manage demand and its resources. Not to say it's not bad to do. I don't want to paint conservation in a bad light. It's just, you have to recognize that it's like a balancing act. If you push here, it's got to go up a little bit there, vice versa.
So without objection, we'll table that and come back with more information and much more discussion. I thought it was good, getting steeped in that. So just quickly, your homework, if you choose to accept it, is to review the alternatives that were considered in the 2013 plan. That's in your plan, and it's also in your workbook, or it's also in the slides that you were given as part of your handout today. There are some other alternatives that this is just a list. We would encourage folks to think beyond this. Tim's example is a good one of strategic location of wells, perhaps could have some benefits at other places. And then we'll also be starting the conversation about screening criteria. So there was the TAC. This is what Nate explained earlier, that the screening criteria were given weights. And so all of that ends up with a numerical score. And so that is helpful to AE2S when they're starting to evaluate the alternatives, when they come back to this group and say, here's the top X number of these that's scored based on your screening criteria. So we'll start an introductory conversation about that. But you can get ahead of the class if you study the 2013 IWRP and talk and read about the alternative screening criteria and the levels and whatnot. So guys, I apologize. I should have not crammed so much into this agenda today. But thank you for your grace and for letting me, allowing us to maybe extend the subsequent meetings to 3 hours, where in this case, it would have given us another 30 minutes of conversation. So I appreciate everybody's time. Sorry for going late, and we'll try not to do it again to you. So any closing remarks from the city or AE2S?
Well, to your defense, I mean, you're still learning how we interact as a group. I mean, to what level we want to be interactive with the different issues that you're addressing with us, and to what level of detail that we're looking for to be able to understand any one particular slide. There's a lot, you know, from my aspect, there's a lot I'm trying to take in, and because this is a rather large, demanding task that we have before us, and
Can you imagine if we didn't have the original plan?
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. If you leave your name tag, I'll collect them, and bring it back. So I'll be the custodian of those. Thank you all. This concludes the meeting. Oh, Jessica had one thing.
I was just gonna say, if there's anything like the conservation information that you all feel like we're asking you something and you don't have enough of a foundation to answer a question, you know, we want to set you up for success. So please let us know, like, hey, we need to spend an hour talking about this thing, or, you know, we need more information about this to be able to answer the questions. Please don't hesitate, to do that.
Okay, James, what did you say?
You can just read my energy. I'm just like, just stating, I guess, thoughts. To echo what Holly said about Belgrade, our board did ask how we might integrate communication or strategizing with Belgrade, Three Forks, and Manhattan and their community plan, speaking about all this, so.
Noted, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very much.